More protests following the U.S. president's decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel.
Fully liberated, Iraq declares victory over ISIS, but the threat of terrorist violence remains.
And making some progress, firefighters in California work to tame wildfires that are fueled by winds there.
These stories are all ahead here this hour. Welcome to our viewers in the United States and around the world. We're coming to you live from Atlanta. I'm Natalie Allen.
And I'm George Howell from CNN World Headquarters. Newsroom starts right now. It's 4 a.m. on the U.S. East Coast. We start in the Middle East. Protests there taking place this hour after what's been described as days of rage by Palestinians. These live pictures in northern Beirut, Lebanon. You see people on the streets. These protests continue.
CNN's Ben Wiedemann is in northern Beirut. He joins us now with the latest on what is happening there. Where are these protesters, Ben, and what can you tell is going on?
Natalie, why don't we go a little closer? We're in the suburb of Okar in northern Beirut. Now, the American embassy is up the hill. You can't even see it from this area. There's a gate that controls access to that area, and there's concertina wire in front of it. Now, earlier this morning, some of the more hot-headed youths among this crowd of demonstrators started to throw water bottles and rocks and sticks. Some in the crowd tried to stop them, saying this has to be a non-violent demonstration, but things got a little out of hand, and the Lebanese security forces responded with tear gas. And there's still sort of a haze of tear gas in the area, that sort of roundabout which leads up to the American embassy. Now, the people taking part in the demonstration today, it's a combination of Palestinian groups, Islamic groups, as well as leftist organizations. And at the moment, you can see, we just saw a volley of tear gas being fired into one of those buildings. And it's sort of, they're trying to disperse the crowd. But at the moment, it doesn't seem like people are running away, despite the fact that tear gas in that area is pretty thick. Now, we spoke to many of the participants in this demonstration, and yes, they are condemning President Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. They're also angry at what is seen as the impotence of Arab leaders when it comes to responding to that. Here, let's go a little closer to that decision. Now, the Arab League did have an emergency meeting last night in Cairo, basically taking that opportunity to condemn President Trump's decision. But beyond that, very little in the way of concrete action, the kind of concrete action many people here would like to see Arab leaders and Muslim leaders to take. Natalie?
Especially since the U.S. Is kind of stepping back diplomatically. Vice President Pence headed to the region, but Mahmoud Abbas saying he will not meet with him. I want to talk with you, though, about that embassy there. Some of the embassies in the region haven't been staffed by the current administration. What do we know about the embassy there, and who's protecting it?
Well, here's somebody who seems to have been affected by that tear gas. Now, I did a count recently. Out of the countries of the Arab world, 9 of those embassies, American embassies, do not have ambassadors. However, there is an ambassador here in Lebanon. Regarding protection provided to the embassy, it's by Lebanese security forces. There are riot police there. I don't think there's any danger that anybody's going to break through the perimeter to the embassy. And of course, as is the case in all American embassies, here's another person affected by that tear gas. In the case of all American embassies, there's also a Marine Guard there. So it really, I don't think the security of the embassy is under threat at this moment, although embassy personnel have been told to cancel all movements for the day. But fact of the matter is, even under normal conditions, the staff of the U.S. Embassy is very restricted in their movements. Natalie?
Yeah, and Ben, as you stand out there in the street and watch this, you've covered the Middle East for decades now. How do you see this issue playing out? As you said, many people in the region are upset that the leaders in the region aren't stepping up more. Certainly the U.S. really has not engaged diplomatically after the U.S. president just issued this statement unilaterally.
Well, you know, this is a very touchy moment in the Middle East. This issue was created by President Trump, essentially out of the blue, and it does appear, at least temporarily, to have refocused the Arab and Muslim world on an issue that it hasn't really focused on much in the last few years. You've had, you know, the Arab Spring, you've had wars in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Libya, which is really sort of the Palestinian issue in terms of the focus of the region, in terms of, for instance, the media, hasn't really been the focus of much attention. Suddenly, it's all on it, and what we're seeing is that there are calls from people like in this demonstration. They want to see their leaders take concrete action to respond to this decision, which has been universally condemned in the Arab and Muslim worlds, although there is a suspicion and there are indications that perhaps certain Arab leaders, excuse me, that tear gas does get to my throat as well, certain Arab leaders have perhaps said one thing in public and said another to the U.S. administration in private. But I mean, what I'm seeing here in Lebanon is a real sort of anger at the inability of Arab leaders really to have an impact or any sort of influence on the decisions of the U.S. administration. We saw the day before President Trump made his decision that you know, he spoke to 4 Arab leaders, the King of Saudi Arabia, the King of Jordan, the President of Egypt, the President of the Palestinian Authority, all of whom told him, don't take this decision. He took it anyway, and their impotence, in a sense, is very plain to see from people like the ones behind me. Natalie?
All right, Ben, we always appreciate your reporting, your perspective. You're going to go in closer. We'll stay in touch with you. Stay away from that tear gas, though. Ben Wiedemann, thank you. We'll get back to you.
I doubt that he will, though. He'll probably keep pushing in there. That's just how he gets the story. You know, Natalie, it's a lot happening out there for sure. Beirut is just the latest example of outrage across the region. At least 4 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, and protesters have clashed for days with Israeli forces in Jerusalem and the West Bank. On Saturday, Arab League foreign ministers called on the U.S. to cancel its decision.
Some groups are also lashing out at U.S. Vice President Mike Pence and his upcoming trip to the region. There are reports Egypt's Coptic Church will not meet with him, and neither will Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas.
All right, on that point, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is also set to meet with the French President Emmanuel Macron in Paris. Let's bring in CNN's Ian Lee following this story for us live in Jerusalem. Ian, good to have you with us. First of all, just to get a sense of what's happening there, tell us about the mood today on the streets. We've seen protests and more are expected.
That's right, George. In about, an hour's time, we're expecting more protests to kick off in Jerusalem and possibly the West Bank. You know, we've been watching these protests on a daily basis, going out to them. And Thursday, we saw the largest protests with thousands of people going out all over the Palestinian territories. This time, though, yesterday, we went to the same place. The numbers have dwindled. You know, when we were watching Ben Wiedemann's reporting, we saw a large number of people in the streets, and we haven't seen those numbers sustain themselves here in Jerusalem, in the West Bank, in Gaza. The numbers have declined a bit, and we've seen, you know, larger protests in neighboring countries like Jordan, Lebanon. You also have Turkey as well. And when you talk to people, they have this sense of defeatism. They believe that you know, they'll still go out, they'll protest, but this is something that they don't feel like they have any hand in being able to stop, at least at this point. And there's some disappointment, as Ben pointed out, with Arab leaders. The people want more action, and we haven't really seen any of that. Well, also, the people say that they want more action from their own leadership. What's the Palestinian Authority going to do? Well, we know they're not going to meet with U.S. Vice President Mike Pence when he comes later in the week. But they want more concrete steps forward. They just don't want this to be the end and really sent off into the abyss.
All right, so for those who do feel abandoned following this announcement, what is the overall feeling with this meeting that's slated to happen between the Israeli Prime Minister and the French President, who has been critical of President Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel?
That's right. This meeting was scheduled about a month ago, and it was supposed to be a friendly lunch between the two leaders, but President Trump's decision has changed all of that. And you're right, French President Emmanuel Macron was one of the first and most vocal voices to come out and warn President Trump about making any such declaration. And the Israelis, as we've seen, have been cheerleaders of this announcement of President Trump. So expect probably a tense meeting between the two leaders, as the French president doesn't want to see this region inflamed and more instability, something that not only he's warned about, but other leaders in this region. But you know, for the Israelis, this is one of the items on their wish list. They've been advocating for this for a long time, so don't expect them to back down either. So that's where we could see this tension in this meeting, George.
Ian Lee following the story live in Jerusalem. Ian, thank you.
Well, President Trump spent part of Saturday honoring those who fought in the civil rights movement, but some are not buying his sincerity.
Mr. Trump attended the opening of the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, and he spoke briefly to the crowd there. Critics ranging from the Jackson, Mississippi mayor to the U.S. Congressman and civil rights icon John Lewis boycotted that event. Many were calling it merely a photo opportunity and an insult to the people who worked and in some cases died for equality in the United States.
Today, what we are doing is standing on principle. We're standing in accord with what the ideals of this civil rights movement means. And that is why we choose not to share a stage with Donald Trump.
Well, on Tuesday, voters in the U.S. state of Alabama, just next door to Mississippi, will choose their next senator, but certainly it's not as simple as that. Republican candidate Roy Moore has been accused of sexual misconduct and worse by several women. Friday, President Trump threw his support behind Moore, and then today the Moore campaign began calling people with a recorded message from the president. That message that Roy Moore will uphold conservative values.
In the meantime, Moore's Democratic rival Doug Jones will be counting on African-American voters. Senator Cory Booker and former Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick campaigned with Jones on Saturday. Both men are prominent figures in the African-American community.
Let's get some perspective now on the political ramifications of a Trump endorsement in the Alabama Senate race and his attendance at that opening of the Civil Rights Museum in Mississippi. We're joined by Indrajit Parmar, professor of international politics at City University of London. Indrajit, thank you for being with us, and good morning to you. Is the criticism of President Trump attending the opening of a Civil Rights Museum, is that legitimate criticism?
Well, I think given that President Trump has played a race card throughout the election campaign and since he was elected as well, I think the criticism is justified. If you look at pretty much every symbolic and other issue related to race and to civil rights and so on, if you look at Take the Knee and the police brutality against that, the NFL players were protesting. If you look at Charlottesville and the equivalence he drew between white supremacists, KKK, neo-Nazis and anti-fascists, the stand he's taken on Confederate statues and saying this is the protection of our way of life and our heritage and so on, I think it's quite clear that this is a move which is designed in a way to galvanize some opposition. But as always, you know, President Trump is very keen to keep together his base. And now, one, his support is slipping on a national basis. But secondly, of course, we have the Alabama special election coming up on Tuesday as well.
Right.
And I think he'll be trying to galvanize those voters.
Right. Yes, he's kind of skirting around Alabama. First, Florida, Panhandle, then Mississippi. It's interesting, the same weekend that he is opening a Civil Rights Museum in Mississippi, that the president continues to encourage the election of a candidate. This is Roy Moore, who clearly has exhibited as a federal judge denying American civil rights. He puts his religious beliefs over following federal laws, and certainly he has not supported the civil rights of gays. So it does spark some interest considering that.
Sure. Absolutely. And I think the opponent of Roy Moore, Doug Jones, has got a record of actually doing something quite positive in support of civil rights and so on from the 1960s. And I think this really is an attempt to try to, among Republican voters who often are tarred with the brush of racism and are not necessarily racist at all, I think it's an attempt to shore their votes up, to say that President Trump has made this overture, a kind of move towards black rights, civil rights and so on, and honouring the heroes as they are. But I think he's trying to shore up that base. He may have the opposite effect, which is to galvanise the 27–28% of the Alabama electorate, which is African American, and others who support civil rights. So it could have a sort of an unintended consequence. But I suspect his main aim is really to sort of suggest to the sort of broader political base, 78% of GOP voters who still support him, that what he's doing is he's showing that he's anti-racist and so on.
All right, it's not so much partisan politics as tribal politics, it seems, these days. Finally, I want to talk to you about what we're seeing, the protests in the region. We just began this newscast with one erupting near the U.S. Embassy there in Lebanon. Why do you think this president did this now and acting unilaterally?
There's two things I think we have to consider. One is we already know that his political base has a large number of Christian evangelicals, and they're very, very solidly attached to Israel. So I think this was one thing that he wanted to do, to try to shore up that base and say, I've delivered on a key promise. But I think the other thing, of course, is the geopolitics of the region, and we've seen that he has not recertified the Iran nuclear agreement. He has been very close to Saudi Arabia. He has stated his support for Israel in the way we've seen, and also I think the Saudi war in Yemen has been backed up, as well as the Saudi interference probably in Lebanon. I think there is an anti-Iran agenda which is going on, and this is really an attempt to solidify the allies in the Middle East that the United States has, in order to kind of really take on what they believe is a growing Iranian and possibly Russian influence as well in that region. So it's a domestic base, but also it's a big geopolitical move, and this could actually have very, very serious consequences for the peace and stability of that region. We've already seen America interfering in that region over several years, over the last decade or so, and the impact that has in regard to ISIS, etc. But yet the United States, despite the rout of ISIS in Syria and Iraq, still has 2,000 troops in Syria. So I think there's a move there to try to continue that move against Iran. And I think this is part of that move. This is part of the bigger picture of that move.
We appreciate your perspective. Thanks so much, Inderjeet Parmar out of London. Thank you.
Thank you.
Still ahead here on Newsroom, we'll tell you why there are high spirits on the streets of Baghdad after a 3-year-long battle against ISIS.
Plus, evacuees are returning to devastated neighborhoods. We're talking about California as firefighters work to control several fires continuing to tear through the state. It's coming up here on CNN Newsroom.
Wouldn't it be great to...
Sunday has been declared a national holiday in Iraq, and that follows a very loud Saturday night with Iraqis celebrating the announcement that ISIS has been driven from their country. People filled the streets, waving flags, honking horns, setting off fireworks. It finally happened.
Yeah, the Iraqi military says it has fully liberated Iraq from what it called ISIS terrorist gang that has retaken full control of the Iraqi-Syrian border. Iraq's prime minister said the dream of liberation, that dream is now reality. An ISIS dream has now come to an end.
We announced to our people and to the whole world that our heroes have reached the final strongholds of Daesh and purified it, raising the Iraqi flag over areas of western Anbar, which were the last Iraqi usurped territories. The Iraqi flag flies high today over all Iraqi lands and over the remotest border areas.
Our Jumana Karacha is across this story, live in Amman, Jordan. Good to have you with us, Jumana. You and I have covered this. We've talked about it for many, many years now, just talking about the fall of these of ISIS in many major cities there. Talk about the significance now of this announcement, not only for Iraq, but how is it being perceived regarding U.S. involvement throughout?
Well, George, when it comes to U.S. involvement, if you talk to Iraqi officials, Iraqi military commanders, and the Kurds, of course, in the north, they would tell you they were very grateful for the U.S. support and the support they got from the international community, that international coalition that has been active in Iraq since 2014, supporting them in their battle. They're also grateful for the support they got from their neighbor, Iran, that played a significant role backing those popular mobilization units, those Shia militias that played a key role in so many of the battles to regain Iraqi territory. But they would tell you that this is an Iraqi moment. It is the Iraqis who really made the greatest sacrifice here. They're the ones who led these battles. They paid the ultimate price. Thousands of civilians and fighters killed over the past few years in these battles to recapture Iraqi territory. And you have millions who have been displaced. This is, of course, a great moment for Iraq and, of course, the international community when you see an end to this phase of ISIS, that group, a terror group that controlled territory, now no more.
All right, so Iraqi officials have control of the Iraqi-Syrian border. That's certainly important. But what is the overall condition of ISIS? Certainly the group has been broken down throughout the region, but how and where is ISIS still viable?
Well, they no longer, George, control significant territory. It's nothing compared to what we saw back in 2014, where they were controlling so many of Iraq's major cities, the same thing in Syria. So you're looking at some pockets in desert areas along the Iraqi-Syrian border when it comes to the Syrian side of the battle. I think this was really well summed up by the top UN official to Iraq, the United Nations Secretary General's representative last month, when he was addressing the Security Council, and he said that ISIS is down, but it's not out when it comes to Iraq. When you talk about this military victory, that is only one component of a very complex battle. So while this is a great moment, there is a lot of hard work ahead, a lot of challenges to make sure that those conditions, George, that we saw years back that allowed for ISIS to gain a foothold and to grow in Iraq, Iraqis need to deal with that, need to deal with the divisions that we are seeing again resurface, especially when you look at the polarization in the region between the Sunni and Shia powers. And then you have addressing the grievances of the Sunni communities, those communities that 3 years ago, some of them allowed ISIS to take hold. Some of them joined ISIS. So the Iraqi government needs to work hard to make sure that they're not feeling marginalized, they're not feeling neglected. And that comes with making sure that these areas that were devastated, these mostly Sunni areas, devastated by the fighting, that you see reconstruction, that they are rebuilt, and the millions who are displaced from their homes are allowed to return. All this keeping in mind that while ISIS as a so-called caliphate is over, the ideology is not defeated, George. So they need to work hard on that. And it still, as a terror group, possesses the capability of carrying out devastating attacks, something Iraqis know all too well.
But on this day in Iraq, the military there saying ISIS has been removed, the country fully liberated from ISIS. Jumana Karacha on that story. Celebrations in Baghdad, of course. Thank you so much for the reporting.
We certainly hope that holds true. Yeah. British Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson is in Iran for meeting with top leaders. Part of the reason he's there is to appeal for the release of jailed British Iranian citizens, including aid worker Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe. She's been held since April of last year on charges of spreading propaganda, which she denies.
On Saturday, Johnson spoke with Iran's foreign minister and will hold talks with President Hassan Rouhani on Sunday. They'll also discuss other issues, including Britain's support for Iran's 2015 nuclear containment deal.
Firefighters have turned a corner on those aggressive fires in Southern California.
But could the forecast impact the progress there? We'll have details ahead. Stay with us. Welcome back to viewers here in the United States and around the world. You're watching CNN Newsroom. Thank you for being with us. I'm George Howell.
I'm Natalie Allen. Here are our top stories. Violent protests have again rocked the Middle East in reaction to the U.S. recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital. This was the scene near the U.S. Embassy in Lebanon just minutes ago. Protesters set fires and clashed with security forces. Authorities responded by firing tear gas to try to disperse the crowd.
The U.S. President Donald Trump honored civil rights heroes at the opening of a museum in Mississippi on Saturday. However, many current activists, they skipped that event at the Civil Rights Museum, saying Mr. Trump's policies are insulting to those being honored at that museum.
The Iraqi military says it has liberated all of Iraq from ISIS. Celebrations erupted in the streets of Baghdad. The Iraqis, as you can see, very happy with that news. The country's prime minister says Iraq now fully controls the border between Iraq and Syria.
One of the wildfires raging in the U.S. state of California, Southern California, well, it's now 100% contained. Crews are monitoring the Liberty Fire through the night. This as they continue to battle 5 other fires. At least one person has died so far. The state's governor calls the long wildfire season the new normal.
U.S. President Trump has been both praised and criticized for his decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. It is a clear break with past administrations, but the status quo has never led to long-term Israeli-Palestinian peace.
Here's CNN's Nick Robertson on whether Mr. Trump's gamble could pay off.
Clashes like these in the past few days, stone-throwing Palestinian youths goading well-armed Israeli security forces, a part of what world leaders openly worried might happen following President Trump's announcement recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Their fears weren't misplaced. There have been casualties. Yet this is only a partial picture. Many of the Palestinian protests have been relatively peaceful and overall have lacked the scale and zeal of past Palestinian actions. And although it's way too soon to know how all this is going to turn out, it raises the question, can President Trump capitalize on his announcement?
We're profoundly grateful for the president for his courageous and just decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel.
Israelis, from the Prime Minister on down, have been gushing in their praise.
It's a good step forward towards peace.
When I came into office,
one lawmaker suggested Trump's name should be carved into Judaism's sacred Western Wall. Another said he'd name a park after Trump. Of course, there's been much speculation about why Trump made the announcement. His critics say it was just to fulfill a campaign promise. Yet the careful framing by the White House and the positive Israeli response perhaps gives Trump leverage other U.S. presidents lacked. Throughout the region, pro-Palestinian protesters have united to say Trump is biased towards Israel and the U.S. can't be a fair peace talks negotiator. The Palestinians' chief negotiator told CNN Trump had effectively shut down talks for a two-state solution.
President Trump made the biggest mistake of his life.
At the Palestinian protests, I talked to people who said this too. But they also told me they aren't happy with their own leadership.
I think the leadership has had many opportunities in terms of a wake-up call, and they haven't listened to it, listened to the street. I hope that it's a wake-up call for them to pursue a different course of action.
Frustrations hang in part on Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas. His post-Trump statement was seen as weak, but also with regional leaders.
Some of the Arab states are not reacting in a very vigorous and obvious way. The statement was dangerous. The reaction should be strong.
Helping Israelis and Palestinians find peace has been one of the bigger challenges for recent American presidents. It's bedeviled the best minds and negotiators the U.S. has been able to muster. Too soon to say if Trump's gamble against advice and orthodoxy will pay off. Nick Robertson, CNN, Jerusalem.
We turn to Southern California now, where 6 wildfires have scorched nearly 73,000 hectares, or more than 180,000 acres, and 85% of that is just from the rampaging Thomas Fire.
Almost 200,000 residents have been forced to leave their homes. Some are now returning, but they're coming back to find that their homes have been reduced to rubble, neighborhoods not standing anymore. CNN's Kyung La has the latest from Ventura, California.
This is what the Thomas Fire in Ventura County, California did just to one neighborhood. You can see that there are cars still in the driveway, and what remains of a house, just rubble. The fire pushed through this community, burning house after house. Just where we're standing, we can see more than half a dozen houses on this block alone. Firefighters extremely concerned about deteriorating conditions and trying to prevent more people from losing so much.
A lifetime, a couple lifetimes. Like I said, they're 84, 83, my mom and dad. They've been living here for 30 years. They built it themselves. There's not much, but if there's a few things that'll help them, you know, have some connection to the past, then that's what I'm trying to do. It's what it is. Material stuff, but like you said, memories of a lot of years. And we'll see where it goes from here. I don't know what they're going to do. It's a process. It's shock, still shock, still trying to understand the little box. It's a little lizard. Don't ask me, but you know what? If it helps, it helps. Despite all the loss, we're fortunate. We have family close by. We have other options, and you know, it's material stuff. Other people are doing so much more, have so much more tragedy in their life that we have nothing to complain about. And you got to just focus on that. Makes the rest of it kind of easier to deal with.
Those Santa Ana wind conditions are expected to increase throughout the weekend, especially as the weekend ends, making the job for firefighters even more dangerous. They are trying to fight the flank of the fire as it grows on the northern side. They say they need this weather forecast to turn around for them. Kyung Law, CNN, Ventura, California.
I mean, just wow, look at that devastation there.
Acre after acre, right?
Yeah.
Derek Van Dam's here to tell us about all the firefighters that are trying to stop this. They've come from all over the country.
10 states, in fact. You know, the U.S. President Donald Trump just signed on Friday the federal state of emergency for the state of California. That freed up a lot of resources, including resources from across the western U.S., including as far away as Alaska. So we now have 10 states participating in the firefighting efforts here in Southern California. 216 firefighting engines. There's also over 700 personnel from these states that are contributing to the firefighting causes in southwestern California. Check out the video behind me. I mean, this is astounding to see just some of the aerial shots in Ventura County of the Thomas Fire. This is the one that has spread so sporadically, so quickly within the past 5 to 6 days. Now burning roughly the size of New York City. It's incredible to just grasp yourself around the size, the sheer magnitude of these flames and how many structures have been destroyed as well. Here's an update on the Thomas Fire. 15% containment, 154,000 acres have been burnt so far. 20% containment with the Lilac Fire just north of San Diego. But check this out. We zoom into the area here on Google Earth. That shaded area of red, that's the entire scarred, burned area from the Thomas Fire. This is nearly the size of Chicago. So we just keep putting in comparisons like this so you at home can get an idea of just how significant these fires really are. The fire weather stretches from Santa Barbara to Los Angeles and San Diego again today. It has expanded a little bit to the north and west. Still a critical fire danger in store for Sunday. We have over 20 million Americans under a red flag warning, but there is some silver lining. There is some light at the end of the tunnel because firefighters have made a major advancement on some of the smaller fires that are across the area. Look at this, with nearly 100% containment for the Liberty Fire, Creek Fire, and the Rye Fire, also at 80 to 85% respectively contained. That doesn't mean that there aren't still smoldering ashes within some of the brush in the ground. So if the winds do pick up, as they're predicted to do so tonight and into early Monday morning, could easily spread and start new spot fires away from the original burn center. Now, we are also starting to see lower relative humidity values, so not good news for the firefighters, but this is an incredible shot here. You can see just the personnel working together with the firefighters in the foreground and the helicopters in the background. They are putting all efforts, all resources towards this, and they are making some on the ground.
All right, we salute them for sure.
Yeah, Derek, thank you.
All right, guys.
Still ahead here on Newsroom, the stakes are high in the U.S. state of Alabama. That's where a heated Senate race is almost coming to an end.
And coming up, the racially charged politics on both sides.
More fallout, more protests following the U.S. president's decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel.
Fully liberated, Iraq declares victory over ISIS, but the threat of terrorist violence remains.
And making some progress, firefighters in California work to tame wildfires that are fueled by winds there.
These stories are all ahead here this hour. Welcome to our viewers in the United States and around the world. We're coming to you live from Atlanta. I'm Natalie Allen.
And I'm George Howell from CNN World Headquarters. Newsroom starts right now. It's 4 a.m. on the U.S. East Coast. We start in the Middle East. Protests there taking place this hour after what's been described as days of rage by Palestinians. These live pictures in northern Beirut, Lebanon. You see people on the streets. These protests continue.
CNN's Ben Wiedemann is in northern Beirut. He joins us now with the latest on what is happening there. Where are these protesters, Ben, and what can you tell is going on?
Natalie, why don't we go a little closer? We're in the suburb of Okar in northern Beirut. Now, the American embassy is up the hill. You can't even see it from this area. There's a gate